Hello, Internet. It's Jeremy Parish from OneUp.com with another off-the-screen look at a new import game for Nintendo 3DS. This one's actually kind of an old import game. It's a remake of Dragon Quest VII from the year 2000, 1999, whenever it came out in Japan. And it is currently Japan's most popular and beloved and anticipated video game, perhaps not surprisingly, because it says Dragon Quest in it. The arrival of Dragon Quest VII on Nintendo 3DS is actually a pretty big deal in the grand scheme of things. If you'll recall, back in 1995-96, Square and Enix, which were separate companies back then, kind of upset the status quo by announcing Dragon Quest VII and Final Fantasy VII would be PlayStation games. Those series had been exclusive, more or less, to Nintendo consoles up to that point. So the fact that they would be supporting the PlayStation and not the Nintendo 64 really kind of shook things up, and it played a big role in Sony's eventual triumph over the N64 and the fact that the N64 didn't do that well in the Japanese market, and so on and so forth. And now Dragon Quest VII is back on a Nintendo system, despite the fact that Sony supposedly offered a lot of support for its development the first time around. And so it's kind of a big deal. The 3DS version of the game really stands apart from the original PlayStation version of the game. The PS1 game was in development hell for a long, long time, and by the time it arrived in, whatever it was, 1999, 2000, it looked pretty chintzy. I mean, it looked visually worse than Breath of Fire 3, which was a game that came out in 97 in Japan, 98 in America. So, coming out 3 years later, it did not impress anyone visually, but it nevertheless was Japan's best-selling PlayStation 1 game, if you can believe that, and it remains the second best-selling Dragon Quest game in the series, right behind Dragon Quest IX, which of course was on the DS. So yeah, if you put the best-selling PS1 game in Japan on the successor to the platform which hosts the best-selling Dragon Quest game in Japan, I think you can see where this is bound for success. It's probably going to do a lot to help Nintendo's sagging bottom line this quarter, not to mention Square Enix's. As you can see, the game has been given quite a visual overhaul. I don't know if you remember the original PlayStation 1 version, but it had very, very low-resolution sprites on very lumpy 3D backgrounds. It just really didn't impress anyone from a visual standpoint. Like I said, it looked dated, not impressive. By the time it came to America, it was late 2001, and the very impressive-looking Final Fantasy X came out like 2 months after Dragon Quest VII arrived in the U.S. as Dragon Warrior 7. It was just badly timed. So the game doesn't really have that great a reputation in the U.S., but all things considered, it doesn't seem like it doesn't seem like such a bad game. It has actually a really strong reputation among Dragon Quest fans. The biggest complaints you're likely to hear about Dragon Quest VII are that it's really, really ugly, which I don't think that's really the case anymore. It's not the most visually stunning game, but I mean, it's been given a significant overhaul. The characters are no longer little lumpy sprites. They're actually very detailed, and they have a lot of personality. When you recruit the character Maribel, and she's in your party, she moves totally differently than these two characters. Your protagonist is kind of your standard generic Dragon Quest protagonist, whereas his companion there, Prince Kiefer, is a bit more swaggering and macho. And then Maribel, when she joins up, she's very prissy and has a very kind of goofy, sort of feminine, but just sort of childish way of running. She always stands with her hands on her hips. The other big complaint you're likely to hear about Dragon Quest VII is that it's very, very slow. People constantly complain about the fact that it's, a good 30 hours before you ever reach the Dharma Temple. Oh, and there's Maribel now. So you don't really get into the depth of the class system until 30 hours into the game, which, for many games is well past the point at which you've seen the credits roll. And the time to battle in most versions of the original version of Dragon Quest VII is between 3 to 5 hours, depending on how thoroughly you talk to people in towns and explore the world. In this case, though, I've managed to make my first battle by about 2.5 hours in. And The big difference is that the opening hours have been greatly simplified. Most of the early game consisted of lots of puzzles, and they've taken those out for this version. Instead, the process of opening up the first world, which I'm doing here with tablets, stone fragments that create a tablet that unseal blocked off lands. The process of actually getting this tablet is much simpler. You no longer have to solve puzzles. You basically just go from place to place, talk to some people, step on the right platforms, and go talk to some more people, and you're good. You have all your stuff. You don't need to push boxes around or figure out how to turn off, douse torches or anything like that. So the time to actually get to the second world is much quicker, and as a result, it feels like it's probably going to have a faster pace overall. Although I have heard that the puzzles haven't been taken out of the game entirely. It's mostly been removed from the introductory sequence, which I suppose, will help with the impression. But I do feel a little disappointed because I've never really played this game before. I'm aware of its reputation. I know a lot of details about its game mechanics. And I feel like it's a game that's really well suited to a portable system. So I'm really happy to see it on 3DS. And I'm hoping it comes to the US. But at the same time, I don't know. I was hoping that I would get the sort of unadulterated, unexpurgated version of the game. But knowing that it's been simplified somewhat is a little bit of a disappointment. But on the whole, I think it's, the benefits probably outweigh the negative. I think the game will be a little more accessible, which is kind of a dirty word these days. But as long as they don't simplify it too much, it should be a fun, satisfying RPG to play. And I imagine it's still an extremely involved, in-depth RPG. I think with the rise of games like Persona 3 and 4, Skyrim, Etrian Odyssey, etc., people have a lot more patience for really, really long RPGs than they necessarily did, 10 years ago when this game first came out. So I think the prospect of a slow burn RPG that takes 100 hours to really finish and explore in its entirety, I think that's going to be a good thing. I think people will appreciate it, honestly. Anyway, here we are, 2.5 hours into the game, and the very first battle. The battle system has been revised somewhat, but it's also very classic. Most of the 3D Dragon Quest to date, so that's Dragon Quest VIII, Dragon Quest IX, have a more dynamic battle style. But in this case, Dragon Quest VII has gone for more of the classic look. And when you first face off against enemies, you don't see your party at all. You see the enemy party, and you choose your commands. And then once you've chosen your actions for that round, it pulls back to this visual style that looks almost like Phantasy Star, which is really it's interesting. You kind of wouldn't expect Dragon Quest to borrow from Phantasy Star a little bit, but it adds up that touch of character and some visual interest that was missing in the original first-person perspective Dragon Quest battle systems, without really compromising the sort of essential feel of the game. I know the Dragon Quest purists will probably appreciate that. And, these are slimes. You fight them, they fight you. You'll eventually win because it's pretty much impossible for a slime to kill any competent video game player. Although one did escape, I'm very disappointed about that. So my party's taken down the slimes, and we get a pittance of experience. And they're stunned because what are these monster things? The big thrust of the plot in Dragon Quest VII is that these characters live in the only island that exists in the entire world, and it turns out the rest of the lands have been sealed away through those stone tablets, and your mission through the game is to unseal the rest of the world. But, the downside of that is that the island that everyone lives on is the island of Grand Estard, or the city of Grand Estard, is it's very peaceful. There are no monsters. You run around the overworld, and you never have to worry about random encounters. Here, that's not the case. Once you start unsealing things, you discover that terrible things, monsters and atrocities, have been locked away, and so there's kind of a give and take with that. In any case, it feels like most of the essence of Dragon Quest VII has come through in this version, and like I said, the visual style greatly improved, a much better looking game. I do kind of miss the sprites in battle, but they've done a good job with kind of creating this cel-shaded style, similar to Etrian Odyssey 4, that carries the essence of the 2D animation. And the character sprites, which before were just, almost indecipherable little blobs, like they really get across Akira Toriyama's graphic style, his unique approach to art. It works really well, and the music has all been orchestrated. It's not just the Dragon Quest orchestral rearranged albums, but it's new arrangements of the music. It all loops very seamlessly. It sounds fantastic. So all in all, this seems to be a very nicely made update to Dragon Quest VII. It loses some things, gains some others, but on the whole, it's it should satisfy most of the Dragon Quest purists. It has visual improvements, musical improvements, still retains that classical Dragon Quest style. It's pretty much what everyone plays Dragon Quest for, I assume. I'll continue playing through the import version of Dragon Quest VII until the US version is announced, and if I find anything equally interesting to report back on, I will do so. In the meantime, though, you can sit and watch and maybe petition your congressman to force Nintendo and Square Enix to bring Dragon Quest VII for 3DS over to the US, because, that's a really good use of our government money. For OneUp.com, I'm Jeremy Parish, and this is off-screen video of Dragon Quest VII.